All right. Well, thanks to Tom's speed reading course in crypto, he managed to cram his entire talk into a much shorter time, so we're back on schedule, which is a good thing. Before we get started, a couple announcements. We've got the shirts available. If you didn't get one because you pre-regged, you want to buy one. I think the XLs are long gone, but the other sizes are there. The shirts for the girls are there too, if you want one of those. We have actually, one of the vendors has got a lot of lockpick sets. I know it looked like they were out of lockpick sets earlier in the day, but if you want one, they're available in the vendor area. And just to start things off, I've got a lockpick set here. Now, I'm wondering who, if any here, knows ToorCon well enough that can tell us who the second keynote speaker for ToorCon 2 was. I'll give you a hint. He spoke yesterday. Well, no, if Juan was there, then... so we've got more there are more lockpick sets available out there. There'll be some giveaways later on at the closing ceremony, so you want to stick around for that. And let's see, we also have a few seats left for the wireless workshop tomorrow. If anyone's interested in taking that, you can talk to the people at the Reg desk. And again, the DVDs that we have that are being produced from all the talks are available for sale. So if there's that you missed or a talk that you really want to hear again, you can buy the disc for 20 bucks and be able to watch it over and over and over again. As I understand it, he's also going to start distributing these things on Google as a pay-per-download. So for a couple of bucks, you can also view these things on the web. So it's a great way to catch up on all the things in the con that you were too busy out in the hallway talking with friends or having lunch or hungover to actually see. So, but right now we've got Chris Eagle coming up. He's going to be talking on ripples in the gene pool. And let's give a big a round of applause for Chris.
All right. First, thanks for sticking around at 5 p.m. on Sunday afternoon and not hopping a flight and all that stuff. Are we good to go with the video in the back? We're good. Okay. So it's mostly stupid hex tricks, right? Ripples in the gene pool is just the catchy title to get through the CFP process. Nothing I say should be attributed to my employer, so don't, we won't go there. I got a lot of slides. I'm going to go kind of fast because there's a good punchline at the end, I think. If you're up close and you can see the small print in IDA. So, the things I'm talking about, like the title says, I call these genetic mutations. They're basically ways to modify a binary so that you are sort of genetically different than every other binary out there. And the reason you might do that is because you run a platform that is on 90% of desktops, and a worm comes out and can get into, say, 90% of the world's computers or desktops or what have you, but you really don't want it to get into yours, okay? So you're at the mercy of the vendor to get a patch out and so on. And these things were really born out of playing Capture the Flag at DEF CON, where somebody hands you some binaries, no source code, you got to run these binaries, yet you have to defend against these binaries, and you find holes in the binaries without source code, you need to find ways to fix those things. Okay, so without getting into the low-level details of trying to do proper binary patching with behavioral modification to add those extra checks to avoid a buffer overflow, okay, are there ways to change the characteristics of a binary such that you are somewhat resistant, I won't say immune, but somewhat resistant to attacks? And that's kind of what the talk is all about. Primarily done with x86 example. It could be adopted to other platforms. This goes back to, Dan Geer put out a paper a while back talking about the software monoculture and the fact that when everybody looks the same, everybody gets sick the same. Okay, so the worm that hits one hits everybody because we have no genetic resistance to these kinds of things. So we throw that up there and move on. And we can talk about things like a vulnerability window, and I don't want to get bogged down in the details up there because I think everybody out there is pretty familiar with this kind of stuff. Think about a time frame that runs from the discovery of an exploit or vulnerable condition to the disclosure of that vulnerable condition. Okay? And depending on the nature of the discoverer and the way they choose to disclose and all that stuff, you never quite know how long this period might be. Okay? And generally, in order for us to find out about it, it most frequently requires a cooperative discoverer, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you do find boxes over in the wild and realize that there's an exploit that was previously unknown. But during this period, okay, there's essentially no defensive capability, right? Because if you don't know about something, how are you going to defend against it? Okay? I mean, we could talk about all the other high-tech whiz-bang ways to stop ODE in its tracks, but that's not what we're here to do. Once the thing is disclosed, and that could be because somebody stands up and says, yeah, here's a proof of concept ODE, or it could be because the vendor says, we've spent some time working on it, and here's the patch, so you know when the patch arrives that there was a problem, and people reverse engineer the patch, and then they come up with their own proof of concept exploits, and so on. But from the time that you have disclosure until a patch is available, then how do you defend yourself? You know this problem exists. Hey, this is the kind of gut-wrenching decision-making thing that you get stuck with. Do I need to keep this server up and running? Okay, is it a critical service, and our business process says we can't take it down, or the has got to have his email or whatever it might be. So maybe you have to keep running this service, okay, awaiting a patch. So we need to have some way to mitigate, okay, and maybe that's going to be snort signatures and dropping packets and other kinds of things like that. But this is what I'm talking about today, is maybe another technique for mitigation, okay. And hopefully this particular window from disclosure to patch is shorter than the time to turn around and generate automated attacks like worms that will own everybody before the patch ever even hits the streets. Okay, so maybe there are some simpler things that we can do to help mitigate, and that's the idea here. So we can then start talking about third-party patching. One of the problems that people have is, or they like to say, well, vendors take too long to patch, okay, which may or may not be true, and again, we're not here to debate that. But lately, we've started to see third parties offering patches, okay, so it is somewhat rare, but to be happening more often, especially in the last year. We've had Ilfac's WMF patch came out back around New Year's time. EI has put out at least one Internet Explorer patch, and then we've got, well, the next slide talks about this group now that's called ZERT, which you may or may not have heard of. I'll talk about them in a second. The bottom line is, these things tend to be controversial. Okay, rarely is a vendor going to say, yeah, apply that. We're a little, we can't get the patch out, but these guys who don't have source code manage to do it. But the problem then is, who's going to back that thing up if it does bring your servers down or breaks the service and so on. So there may be liability issues, and these again remain somewhat controversial. And your grandmothers might say, "Who's Ilfac anyway?" Okay, you say, "Trust me, he's a good guy. He knows a heck of a lot more than I ever will." But you have that process. We sort of trust, and you talk to your friends, and maybe within the security community, we do this, but go out and tell an organization with 10,000 seats that they should apply this patch from a guy they've never heard of, perhaps, then you might have problems there. Okay, so ZERT is a more organized effort at doing these things, and if you're interested in reading more, there's a URL where you can go read about them, and there's some pretty high-powered guys participating in this effort. Okay, and their goal is basically to provide interim patches, not necessarily permanent patches, while you're awaiting the official vendor patch. Okay, and the latest one they did for the VML problem with Internet Explorer that just came out, when they designed that patch, they actually built in rollback capability, knowing that the vendor patch would probably be the way to go. So they built that thing so that it could be rolled back when Microsoft did finally come out with a patch. But again, Microsoft ultimately, I think, said, we can't endorse this way of doing things, and yet it was one possible defense. Okay, and the techniques I'm going to talk about will probably be poo-pooed by the vendor as much as anything out here. Okay, so then I'll do my blurb on responsible disclosure. Okay, which is, I don't care if you disclose or not. If you're a vulnerability researcher and you find this stuff, that's your business, and I don't care whether you disclose or not. But I also don't care if you coordinate with a vendor or not. I'm not here to preach any of this stuff. What I would like to see, people that do choose to disclose, okay, it'd be really nice if you talked about some ways to mitigate. Okay, I mean, you've done all this work, how to, keep the attacks from getting through, perhaps. And I think that's the most responsible thing that you can possibly do if you disclose. Okay, is at least tell me how to mitigate the problem. Okay, and whether you offer a patch or not, or whether you just tell me to block it at the firewall, or even quit running the server, tell me something to do. Okay, so I can talk my grandmother through the process. Okay, so any questions so far? I just wanted to blow through the intro stuff, and we'll start talking about these mutation things. Okay. The idea here is, frankly, binary patching can be kind of hard, and it might be out of the realm, of a lot of people's skills. Okay, to actually get into a binary and insert new code that fixes a problem, that checks for a problem and and prevents it from happening the right way, the way the vendor might do it in source code. Okay, so this stuff can be a little bit tricky. Okay? So with mutations, all we're looking to do are fairly changes to a binary that doesn't necessarily change its behavior, but changes its characteristics sufficiently that these automated attacks don't own that box when they do own other boxes. Okay, and you can get away with changing surprisingly few bytes in a binary to make this sort of thing happen. I'll have some demos here later on. Okay, as a result, because we're not changing the behavior, meaning we're not adding a check for a buffer length like that, we're just changing some characteristics. Okay, the vulnerability is probably still present, almost certainly still present. Okay, but we've made ourselves different, so when somebody tries to attack us, they don't get in, and hopefully they just move on. Okay, so it does remain security through obscurity. We are not unexploitable, and you should never consider this a long-term solution. Okay, and then some of the assumptions that I'm making going in here are that automated exploits are the kind of thing we're really talking about here, like worms and so on, generally built for specific target layouts. Okay, that's the whole automated nature. They don't tend to get smarter. When a worm lands on a box, it turns around to scan and try to attack another box. It doesn't get somehow smarter so that if the target is not exploitable on the first try, that the worm sits there wondering and thinking, okay, how am I going to get in given that my first attempt failed? Okay, so we're relying that the behavior that a worm exhibits remains constant kind of across all the platforms that it's attacking. Okay, so that if we can look different than what its expected layout is, then the worm will not be able to penetrate us. And then we say automated attackers, and you can read that as script kiddies if you like. Just move on when they don't receive the expected results. Okay, so if we say, for example, that Metasploit is the script kiddie tool of choice, whether it's for payload generation or they're choosing their attacks and actually launching their attacks through Metasploit, then if we can defeat the Metasploit stock exploit for a particular vulnerability, then we've taken a step in the right direction. Okay, and it's going to take a little bit more knowledge than the attacker may be able to gather about our platform in order for them to come up with a good working exploit. Maybe they could brute force their way in, or maybe they're not smart enough to, but if they don't know the target layout, they're going to have certainly a harder time. Okay, so into binary patching, again, a bit of a black art. Proper fixes can generally require a lot of additional space in an executable to actually insert the behavior that you want to wrap around some exploitable condition. And that space can be hard to come by, and there's a lot of things that you have to take into account when you're trying to find space and adjust offsets and do these sorts of things. So I'm going to say that for most of us, that's a hard thing to do. Okay, maybe you even require functions that weren't originally imported into binary, and so you have to get into changing import tables and so on, relinking your own stuff. So with simple mutations that I'm going to look at, and I'll talk about how these mutations might apply for stack-based overflows, heap overflows, format string problems, and uninitialized stack variables, which are some of the types of attacks that have been talked about down at the binary level. I'm not talking about JavaScript stuff here, but down at the binary level. Basically, very simple changes that we can make, or surprisingly simple, that will defeat some of the stock exploits that are out there for some of these types of attacks. So I'll lead off with how these mutations might be used to slow down, defeat a stack-based buffer overflow. And for those in the audience, if you've never looked at this stuff, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically, when one function calls another function and you have buffer overflow, you build your stack from bottom to top with the caller pushing some arguments down here, saving a return address as part of the call instruction, maybe saving a frame pointer, and ultimately allocating some local variables, right? Simple stack frame. Okay, and it's typically a stack-based buffer overflow involves a buffer up in this area in which we can overwrite beyond the end and corrupt these two pieces of data here, okay, which are control information usually. Okay, your saved EIP. If the attacker can control that, then everything's over, right? Okay. So that's all the background you're going to get on stack overflows. Okay. This thing, local variables usually set up in a prologue. You'll see a statement something like this. Okay, subtract 120 hex from ESP. That just subtracts ESP, starts here. We jump it back up to here. Now that function owns all of this space and can use it any way it wants. Right? The compiler typically chooses a layout and so on. We need to understand why that works. And that's the main thing we need to understand with stack layout. So the way that you perform this simple change in the stack to kind of, again, not defeat, but repel, temporarily anyway, an attack against a stack-based buffer overflow is we're going to modify the way we grab this local variable space. Okay, so again, these are two typical function prologues, and when you see something like this, subtract 4 hex from ESP, okay, this is usually a 1-byte constant, and that's important to understand, okay, because we just want to manipulate grabbing that local variable space, and you have to know what you can work with. Okay, without trying to find extra space, okay, I can modify this. I have a 1-byte constant to work with here. And unfortunately, that's a signed constant. Okay, so if I wanted to grab more space on the stack for this function, okay, I could grow the constant up to 7C hex and maintain 4-byte alignment and not go to a negative number. Is everybody comfortable with that idea? Okay, whereas this is a 4-byte constant down here. So if I decided that I want to grab significantly more stack space than they're already grabbing right here, 414 hex, I actually have 4 bytes to work with, and I can grab basically all the space I want. Okay? So I can twiddle just a couple bytes right here and change the layout of the stack. Okay? Something that nobody else is using, and again, the attacker expects a particular layout because they know how much room they have to overflow the buffer, and they know where they have to stick their EIP into that data that they want to land in the buffer. And if we can throw their alignment off, okay, their attack's not going to work. All right? Okay, so grabbing more space doesn't cut it, okay, because we can grab all the space we want, but that doesn't really change the layout of the local variables in the function that has the problem. Okay, so you may have to adjust some pointers to your local variables, and you have ESP-based frames and EBP-based frames to worry about. Okay, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, so I'll show you a picture. Okay, here's a simple disassembly, okay, where we have a function prologue grabbing all this local variable space. Okay, IDA shows us the stack layout of this function where IDA has identified some local variables up here. We see the saved EBP sitting on the stack, the saved return address on the stack, and an argument way down here. Okay, and we can deduce, if you've never spent any time in IDA, that this is an array simply because IDA sees no other references into the stack between this variable, okay, which sits 1,016 bytes above the saved EBP right here. Everybody comfortable with that assumption? Okay. Right there, no references in that big gap, so we can deduce that that's an array. And so we say that, let's just presume that this array can be overflowed by an attacker. Okay, so the things the attacker needs to know are that this array, the start of this array, sits 1,016 bytes above saved EBP. So if they inject more than 1,016 bytes, they're going to start to clobber EBP. And if they get more than 1,020 bytes, they start to take over the saved return address on the stack. Okay, so we agree on that, right? Okay, and this is the number that right here, subtract ESP 414 hex, that grabs all this space and reserves it for the function, this vulnerable function. Okay, it's an EBP-based frame, and so if you really want to know how the layout looks, then you have all these references, relative offsets from EBP, used to access all those variables that we just saw on the other side. Okay, so within this, accessing local variables takes on this form. Specifically, the start of that array is sitting here at EBP minus 1016, and we'll call that the local exploitable buffer right there. Okay? So again, the attacker expects to send 1,024 bytes of data at our program and take over EIP. Okay? So what can we do? Well, again, that was a 4-byte constant, so if we just flip a bit there, flip a couple and we can subtract 814 hex. You know, what's the impact on the stack layout? Well, if I adjust all my pointers, okay, based on EBP, so I have to tediously go through this entire function and change all the offsets from EBP, then we get a new stack layout that looks like this, okay, where everything, and I just take everything and subtract off an extra 400 hex from it. That makes the math easy. Okay, then all these variables shift higher up in the stack, and we're left with a 24-byte hole sitting underneath the exploitable buffer. Okay, now the attacker who sends his 1024-byte blob of data expecting to own my box doesn't come close to touching EBP or EIP. So his attack fails. Okay, all his extra stuff that was supposed to take over the control structures lands in this pad that we've built right here. And again, you know, he may or may not understand why it fails. He may try a brute force attack. He may try to send more data. He doesn't know for sure how to make things line up and make sure that he owns EIP every time. Okay? We don't have to do 400 bytes here. We could change this every time across every computer in our network. Okay? Subtract 814 or C14, whatever we want to do. Remember, we have a 4-byte constant here. Of course, we're using more memory, and there's a potential if this is a recursive function that we're going to use a lot more memory than we had originally intended, but memory's cheap these days, and hopefully we don't go there. Okay? So here's the new stack layout, and here's everything that would need to be changed to take all of those local variables and shift them up 400 hex bytes higher up in the stack. And that's kind of a lot of work, because if in this function we do a lot of reference to local variables, okay, then you know, we got a lot of hand changes to make right here. But we do it one time, and maybe we can even automate the process when we go to apply the patch. Okay? This buffer effectively becomes, in this case, a 2040-byte buffer, which again, we haven't changed any behavior, we just changed a characteristic, and so we don't look like the rest of the world, and the same stock exploit that might get everybody else hopefully won't get us. Okay? There are other ways to do this. Instead of moving every local variable right here, we do the same adjustment here. We grab more stack space, and we're only going to change one set of offsets. We're going to move the buffer up here on the top side of locals. Okay? And this turns out to be considerably less work, because I don't need to adjust any of the offset to all of these ints in the stack, and I only have to go find the one place where we refer to the start of the buffer and change its offset from EBP minus 1016 to EBP minus 2064. Okay, the buffer is now 1024 bytes in size, but that's more than the programmer planned for initially anyway. Okay, do we still have an overflow condition? Yes, because we're not checking any lengths. Okay, but we present even a slightly different layout. In this case, the attacker could overflow, and they might corrupt some of these local variables. Okay, and I call these now poor man's canaries, because we've put corruptible data. We've put corruptible data in between the buffer and the target EIP. Any one of these, if the attacker doesn't get the right value into that location, depending on the nature of the function, may result in an error condition which causes the function to terminate maybe. Okay, you know, if this thing is non-null or it exceeds some certain value, exit 1. Okay, and they don't come down and they don't touch EIP. So again, a slightly different layout with perhaps a more challenging problem for the attacker, because they're not expecting this. Okay, you know, and you can take this and permute it any number of ways. Okay, and the attacker would have to have overwrite with valid values here that would make all of this survive until this function. Okay, and then they have to know exactly how far away they were. So a little bit tougher problem to overcome, especially when you don't have the binary in hand and you can't do any debugging and figure out the stack layout, because we don't look like everybody else. Variations on this involve simply going into every single function in your program, okay, including main, and forget about making any adjustments. Just grab more space on the stack in every prolog in your function. Okay, and then you've moved those saved EVPs, right? The attacker knows where their shellcode is landing somewhere in the stack. Okay, and if they're using a specific address, if they're not using like jump ESP type shellcode, okay, if they're actually trying to overwrite with a very specific address to try to hit into their shellcode, as soon as we start adjusting things in the stack, just make those buffers move because you're grabbing more space in the underlying functions, then we can, that's poor man's stack randomization. And again, we present a different target layout of the stack when they come to attack us. And reordering local variables, you got a little flavor of that in the last example, but we could reorder things. Maybe you have a file descriptor is one of your local variables, and they try to write to the file descriptor and check some error condition, and if you can put the file descriptor between the buffer and the saved return address, and they corrupt the file descriptor, you may generate an error condition again that causes the function to terminate. Okay, any questions on stack mutations? Okay, we're actually going to come back because they work for format strings too. Okay, heap mutations. Okay, heap mutations rely on heap overflows. We know that the attacker knows they're going to overflow a heap allocated buffer, and they're going to corrupt some control structures that immediately follow that buffer. Okay, and so, and here's a picture, right? Data control, data control, data control. I mean, yeah, I did that in a pretty quick, but that's really what it looks like. And if the attacker, if there's a heap overflow condition, the attacker may be able to jam a lot of data in here, and they're going to corrupt these control structures here. But being able to corrupt these usually means you've got to know the size of this data, the layout of this data pretty, you got to be pretty dead on, so that when you overlay these control structures with your attacker supplied data, they're landing in the right place. They're going to be picked up in that unlink or free operation, okay, and that results in a heap overflow. Okay. Okay. The problem in fixing these things is there's essentially two ways that you figure out how much data you want to allocate when you malloc a heap block. Okay, you may just be malloc size of some struct, and that becomes a fixed size value, and so you see a constant pushed onto the stack that's used in the malloc, and you always get 80 bytes every time you go through that section of code. All right, and so if we want to change. If it turns out to be a heap overflow with that, all we have to do is change the constant, grab more space, and then instead of 80 bytes here, we've grabbed 128 or 256, and this control structure is farther away than the attacker anticipated, okay, and the heap overflow fails. Okay? Then we have the situation where the size of the data that we need to allocate in the heap is computed dynamically. Okay, which is a little tougher problem because there's no one constant we can go in and change. Okay, so we would actually have to insert code to say, once the thing has been computed, we want to tack on an extra buffer of, say, 80 bytes on the end, so that it's like, because the attacker may know that if they supply X amount of data, an allocation is going to be made according to the amount of data that they supplied, but we want to change that number. Okay, unfortunately, that involves adding additional code to modify the computed size. We do some computation. We decide that the size needs to be 128 bytes. Now we need to get in and bump that up a little more to something that the attacker doesn't expect. Okay? So these real simple ones, right? If you have a malloc 16, all you have to do in the hex header is go and change that to malloc 64. Okay? And we've pushed those control structures farther down, and the attack fails. Okay. Unfortunately, again, when you do a computed size, a lot of times there'll be a string length call. Okay, compute the size of this string because we want to be real safe about doing our string copy when we move the string over. So we call string length, we add 1, then we're safe to do a string copy, or things like that. Okay, so it's the add 1. If they literally add 1 on the end of string copy, change it from add 1 to add 80. There's still sufficient space to copy the string in, but it's more than the attacker knew from looking at that code that was going to get allocated. So that may help you there. In a lot of other cases, if we're dynamically computing things, often there's a fixed size portion of a struct and a computed size portion of a struct. Okay, so if we go in and we just modify the constant that we're starting off with the fixed size portion of the struct before we do the computed size portion and add that in, okay, there's an opportunity to go in and make sure we allocate more memory than the hacker was expecting us to allocate, pushing the control structures a little farther down and out of the attacker's reach. Okay, so any questions about heap mutations? Yes?
Yeah, adding stuff to balance, how does that push you into either vulnerabilities?
Well, because we control what gets added right here.
Sure, the program might have had tests before its calculation to make sure you wouldn't do it in either overflow, and now you've invalidated those tests.
If it's a computed size kind of thing, yeah, you're right. So you would have to be very careful to see what kind of test, what kind of maximum potential vulnerabilities, or yeah, it'd be worth looking at. Yeah. Yeah.